We will continue. We're going to go to 9.1, which is the superintendent's update. Did you have anything else on the update, Dr. Little, or you want to go straight to
No,
the
ma'am.
e-learning?
I'd like to go straight to e-learning because this is going to be a pretty substantial conversation. We have with us tonight Mr. Howard Bissell, who has been working on this and collaborating with our teachers, I believe, since September, October, and has done quite a bit of work with a lot of our advisory councils. And he is here tonight to talk about what he's learned and what has been created, and we'll kind of ask for a request, I believe, at the end of this.
Thank you, Dr. Little, Madam Chair, members of the board. I present to you for information this evening a proposal to take part in a pilot program made possible through the South Carolina Education Oversight Committee for e-learning days in Lexington District 1, which would essentially give us the opportunity to conduct teaching and learning on days where we may need to cancel school for inclement weather or for other reasons. So starting off, talk a little bit about why we would want to consider this proposal. It allows us to leverage time, space, and place with the technology and access that we have available to us in Lexington 1. E-learning days would provide us a great deal of calendar flexibility. It would allow us to eliminate weather makeup days as we're structuring our calendar. We'll talk a little bit more about the type of impact that can have on teaching and learning through the duration of the school year. And it also, maybe most importantly, gives us continuity of teaching and learning when the district is forced to cancel school on those particular days, and thinking about the time outside of class when those cancellations take place. We have some systems and structures in place that would allow students to maintain their pace of learning in their classes. So up to this point, as Dr. Little mentioned, our Teacher Leadership Council had started in the early fall, actually, investigating this and really dug in to consult with some districts in South Carolina who were involved in the first two phases of the pilot in October. They did a good bit of that research and also connected with some districts outside of South Carolina, in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. We've had the opportunity to have some conversations with the SE Education Oversight Committee and talk through their guidelines for the pilot and for their approval of applications. And we've also had an opportunity to talk to a lot of stakeholders, parents, teachers, students, principals, central service leaders. And as we talk to all of those groups, we've heard a widespread support in favor of this proposal, with some entirely valid questions along the way about what the logistics look like and how this would work. There is a URL there for a live frequently asked questions page that you can access. I believe we made it available in your board packet as well, but very soon we'll have that posted and available on our website so that that can be public facing and transparent for everyone who might have some questions, and we'll continue to add to that as we work through some of the logistics. So you might be asking, what are e-learning days? What does this look like? So essentially, in the event of a school cancellation, students and teachers are going to engage in meaningful learning experiences at home instead of essentially burning that day and having no teaching and learning happening in the middle of a week or in the middle of a quarter or semester. All the other employees in our district can engage in online professional learning opportunities or alternate assignments so that there's not a break in their work week or their pay schedule. So this has an impact on everyone within the district. Knowing that there are going to be some contingencies and there may not be the opportunity for everyone to engage on that particular day or days, we have a 5-day grace period built in for when students and teachers return from school to leverage some supports at the school to make up for that work. And then we'll talk a little more in depth about how we can eliminate weather makeup days from the district's academic calendar and the impact that'll have on our students and teachers. So how will it work? We're looking at targeting grades 4 through 12 to make digital assignments and resources available through our learning management system resources. Primarily, that's Schoology in grades 6 through 12. We also have access to Google Classroom that's used in a number of different classrooms. Either way, it's an opportunity for teachers to post resources and assignments and structures for learning and students to access that and process digital workflow so that these things can happen online in a digital format instead of face-to-face and through paper and pencil. Teachers are going to establish online office hours to support and monitor accountability for students that are submitting. So essentially, a teacher's working through their day on that day that we might be canceled. They're just doing it online and providing support to students as they go and as they have questions. So if you're looking at it from the student perspective, students in grades 4 through 12 are going to access materials through those learning management systems. They're going to engage in that work. If they have questions, they'll be able to reach out directly to the teachers. And again, there's a 5-day window once we return from school in case something wasn't quite clicking during that day, or they weren't able to access the internet, whatever the case might be. There's this kind of gray area that we can work in to make sure that all the students have the supports that they need. The accountability for it is attendance. So if the students complete the work that they're assigned for that particular day, they're marked present, and if they don't, then they're marked absent. And so their method of accountability then is their attendance for that particular day or days. So in 4 through 12, we have the ability to leverage technology to do this. In grades 4K through 3, we don't have, the technology in those grades are not as abundant, and that's by design. We feel in Lexington 1 that developmentally at that age, we need students that are not working in a one-to-one environment all the time. But we will have assignments and engagements that are meaningful for these students. They'll just be made available through a paper and pencil format. All of the resources will be available online and digitally, but we'll make extra accommodations for those students so that they're able to work and have a meaningful experience in an interdisciplinary fashion and hitting all the different subjects that they would see and interact with on a daily basis. Same 5-day window applying to our younger students in those primary grades. When we talk about other employees in the district, we're looking at providing the most relevant options that we can for them to make up for the time that they're not working that day. You think someone who is working, an hourly schedule, this will allow for there to be no interruption in their pay, and they'll be able to work through and work some extra hours within a finite period of time after that cancellation, so there's no disruption there. A number of our certified employees will also engage in some extra hours to make up for it. We'll also have a nice repository of online professional learning that folks can self-select into and take advantage of that time to maybe do a little bit of professional development that they otherwise may not have the time to engage in. If you look at the spreadsheet there, this is something that we were looking at that was produced by another district that had been through the first or second phase of the pilot. And there is a list of all positions in the districts in that A column, and then going across row 1 up there, those are the different options that they might select into in order to make up the time for that day. So everybody's accountable for that day of work, even though they're not physically in the buildings or in their handling those specific daily responsibilities on that particular day. This probably looks a lot better on paper, but the intent here is that you see that there is a sequence for each of these groups of stakeholders, and once we operationalize this, it'll be standard operating procedure. At the notice of school cancellation, teachers will know that they need to have work posted. Students will know that they need to go in and take a look at what they have going on and make a schedule to be accountable for what's happening there. Parents, they'll be aware of what's happening here and hopefully checking in with students along the way to make sure that they're sticking with that accountability plan. And employees are going to select the options that they have available to them to be accountable for the work on that day. It'll probably be most intensive for teachers on that day who are managing assignments that are coming in, questions that are coming in, and really keeping track of the student work and correcting some maybe misconceptions that they're seeing happening. I would envision that a teacher in a middle school or a high school may provide some type of a text for students to engage with and then ask them to participate in a discussion board on that day. And they may respond to a particular prompt based on the text that they read or the video that they watched and interact with some of their students. And then the teacher can be there in that online form, providing some input along the way, really giving students a great opportunity to prepare for the types of learning that they'll be expected to engage in when they leave K-12 education. So we talk a little bit about the calendar impact that this could potentially have. I mentioned earlier that this concept of e-learning days allows the district to create more frequent natural breaks in the calendar. So if we look at where we are right now in the spring 2020 calendar, we have right on the other side. I mean, we can almost see it, smell it, taste it. There's this break that's coming up in March that is going to be much needed for, especially our youngest students, but I think for all the folks that are in our schools working so hard each day. I do have highlighted there February 17th. That's just a couple of weeks ago. That's actually a weather makeup day that we had to make up because of a day that we had to take for weather back in the fall. So you can see there, if we were able to have an e-learning day on that day that we canceled in the fall, we would have been able to provide students with 4 days off there in February. And then not even just a month later, 4 additional days. We've got that weather makeup day built in on the 12th there. And then coming up in April, that 13th, April 13th, the Monday after Easter, that's a weather makeup day as well. So, you know, knock on wood, we won't have to initiate any cancellations between now and then. We'll be able to maintain those breaks, which we know from stakeholder feedback over the past couple of years are really important to our kids and just staying fresh. There are some other considerations there. When you go for a very long stretch of time, you see attendance issues arise, and you see leave being taken from teachers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we look back at what happened last year with some of the weather makeup days. But I think another important point to make here is that these frequent breaks that are built in can create natural barriers to the spread of illness, particularly during cold and flu season in these spring months when we have these weather makeup days built in. You know, the typical gestation period for influenza is about 2 days. So our director of nursing explained to me very nicely and concisely that if you have these 3 or 4 day breaks built in sporadically and naturally, they form natural barriers in the calendar. So that if a student were to, say, become infected with influenza on a Thursday, if they're coming back on a Friday, they might not know it and they're coming back to school, but they still could be passing that virus around. So not a medical professional by any means, but it makes sense if you have a couple of extra days when those things are floating around in schools for students to be home and not there mixing it up with other kids. It's going to cut down on the spread of illness. Let's take a look here just real quick. No, I'm sorry, I highlighted the makeup days that we still have if we don't have to cancel there. So you can see where those natural breaks would be brought in this year still. If we had e-learning days in place, we wouldn't have to worry about having to cancel as we know we have them. But let's jump back to fall of 2018 real quick here. If you remember in September of 2018, Hurricane Florence came through our coast. Maybe not here in Lexington so much, but along our coast. And then not even a month later, we had Hurricane Michael that came through. So we had 5 days that we had to cancel in the fall of 2018. Now we had those weather makeup days built in, 3 of them at least. But I want to take a look at what that spring looked like for us and think about what that could have looked like if we had e-learning days in place. Now you see the blue circles there are weather makeup days. We had one built in on February 18th, which would have been a 4-day weekend break, natural barrier for students. We had one built in on March 15th, which would have been another natural barrier and a break for students and teachers. And then April 22nd. Because we had the 5 days of cancellation in the fall, what ended up happening is we had to come to school on the 18th, on the 15th, and on the 22nd, but we also had to add a half a day on the 5th of June, the 6th of June, and then another day for teachers on the 10th of June. So if you look at the time there across that calendar, there really aren't a whole lot of natural breaks for students and for teachers for that matter. And if you go back, really the last time there was an extended break would have been the beginning of January. So you see there's a real long time there before you get to spring break. That's a pretty long push, especially for little kids. And there's an impact on teacher attendance as well. On the 18th of February, we looked at teacher attendance, and I believe there was 236 leave requests that were put in on that particular day, just for to build a break in there. And as that push came through March and April and May even, we saw ranges of 230 so up to about 400 and 430. So you got a lot of folks that are putting in leave at that time, just because they need some natural breaks built in there. So we're thinking about what our next steps will be. If we're able to move forward, we know that one phase is providing the overarching structure. There's a lot of logistics that we need to dig into, and a lot of them focus on providing professional learning and support for folks in the school to make sure that they're comfortable with handling this type of learning. We know we need to establish points of contact at each school to streamline that communication, and we also know that the curriculum, the content, the resources, the lesson templates are going to be critical to making sure that everything is delivered in a coordinated manner within those schools and also consistent across the district. We know we need to provide meaningful professional learning resources for our non-instructional folks. We also know that in grades 4 and 5, where devices don't go home, we need to understand where our pockets of folks are without access at home so that we can make the appropriate accommodations for them to have access to devices if needed. Communicate. This is a fairly large program and implementation. And so touching so many stakeholders and having an impact on so many stakeholders, we need to make sure that everyone's in the know and has access to the information that they need and the questions they need to know about. I mentioned earlier that we spoke to a number of advocacy groups in our district, principals, teachers, parents, students, and we've got some pretty good feedback. Again, some questions here or there about what if this and what if that, but at the end of the day, folks are really recognizing that what this can do to flex the calendar out is definitely a positive for both teachers and students. The calendar flexibility in general is a high spot, but really, I think what's driving this home and making people really get excited about implementing this is the continuity in learning. You know, if we had to cancel school for a day or two, you've got folks that are on a track and they're trying to get to a certain point in their curriculum and achieve some very specific learning targets with students. They don't have to just take a pause and lose all that momentum in the middle of all of that. And ultimately, that's really the most important thing here because that's what affects kids most directly with this initiative. Okay, so to wrap up, pending local board approval and SC Education Oversight Committee approval of the district's application, e-learning days will go into effect this coming August 2020, and the Oversight Committee will notify the district when they approve our application by the end of this school year. We'll have that submitted by mid-April. Okay, so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Do we have any questions? I have a couple. Anybody want to start? I'll start. I know that this is kind of in a perfect world, and this is like when the governor says we're going to shut the schools down because they're going to be sites for the hurricanes, and we don't lose power, and we have running water, et cetera, et cetera. I know like last night in Tennessee when they have that tornado came through and devastated Nashville. How do you incorporate like a sudden event like that? I mean, that's not really designed for e-learning, is it?
Yeah, well, it can be. Okay. It can be. I think we find the biggest challenge with our younger students, particularly because of where we're very tech heavy, where it's appropriate in grades 6 through 12. In grades 4K through 5, they're not taking devices home every day, right? And they're not, the teaching and learning that they're engaged with in the student engagement model and the workshop model is not tech heavy focus. And so there's a bit of a curve there and that's where a lot of our professional learning will have to lead in this spring and throughout the summer. But the situation that you described for grades 6 through 12, that's what they're doing on a daily basis.
So what if they don't have power?
Yeah.
That's what I wonder about.
So great point. So there's really nothing we can do about that on that day. And really where we've seen success in districts that have gone through the first 2 phases of the pilot, and thank goodness there's been two phases of the pilot to work through some of these things. It's that 5-day 2-day window to have some leverage when students come back, and there is power in the school, and there is internet access in the school, and there are supports and schedule structure that allow them to engage in some of those things they couldn't get to on that day off. That's where they take advantage of that time and make that up.
And that kind of segues into my next question. I know we held back and we did not go through the application process because our district is so large. We wanted to hear from some of the smaller districts and let them come up sort of with the pros and cons. What pros and cons have we heard from the test sites that are applicable to what we're going to do in Lexington 1?
Yeah, great question. So some of the pros are that what we spoke about earlier, the consistency and instruction and teaching and learning. They're not having to break that up and step back and take a break and then try to get charged back up again when they come back in. Also, a huge uptick in teacher collaboration and really pulling together in their everyday planning and ownership over the students, because they have the situation in front of them, and then they realize how they can leverage digital learning in some different ways. And so it's really pushed the professional learning and mindset of teachers in those districts where before it was really kind of an option, I guess. So if they wanted to go that route with the way that they ran their classroom, they saw the benefit of that in these other districts, and it's changed the way that they've approached instruction with their students.
What cons have you heard?
Yeah, so cons, I think some things that came out of not knowing what you don't know. One was coordination among teachers. And so, there was a pilot district where there was some negative feedback because students were working the entire day, because in order for the teachers to provide work that they felt was meaningful, they provided more than what would really actually need to happen in a day or in a block of time or in a period. And so those were some quick corrections that districts made when they realized that students were getting loaded down with work that actually exceeded the time that they would even be in school on that day. So I think a lot of logistical things and just the ability to coordinate within the school, and we're looking at providing some very specific templates to help teachers think through what it is they're providing, and some suggestions like if you are facilitating an e-learning day, leverage your normal schedule on that day and plan for engagements with students that would take about the amount of time you would see them, and then make yourself available on the time that you would have a planning to be available to them.
I mean, I hate to think about it, but if the coronavirus, if we had to take off a couple weeks of school to kind of get the virus to clear out, has anybody ever set the time frame where it's sort of the diminishing returns, where it's just not productive after X amount of days? You just can't do e-learning indefinitely, I guess, like that?
Yeah, I think that's a very real thing to consider. There will be diminishing returns, and so it doesn't mean that you can't do it, but even to think for an extended amount of time, learning in a distance model or learning from home, you're never going to be able to replace that type of interaction with the teacher and with the peers that you'll have at the class. So I haven't seen anything to this point that quantifies it.
We probably don't know quite yet,
that
because
puts a
I
number on
imagine most of our sister districts, it's only been a couple of days that they practiced. I mean, that they've done this, right?
That's right. That's right. And so, generally speaking, if you're thinking about inclement weather, you could say we could be prepared for 5, and that's probably not going to happen altogether. It might, but it's a much different construct if you're thinking about a situation where you're out for
14 days.
14 days. So the base structure is a good structure for any type of e-learning implementation. The dynamics change a little bit when you're talking about what you do for an extended period of time.
It's kind of ironic that you put this on the agenda, 3 or 4 months ago, not knowing what we would be dealing with. It's kind of perfect timing. So thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. And I guess I love the idea of this. I would probably be a little reluctant to have a calendar that didn't have any makeup days on it.
Yeah, me too.
And I've wondered if, as part of this model, has there been discussion about, so you've got an event that happens unexpectedly, and at 4 a.m. we get a call from Mary Beth Hill saying there's no school today, and and that's happened. Is there any thought of having a couple of weather e-makeup days in the spring where the students stay home, but it's an e-learning day to make up for a day that there was just no way to get galvanized to make, an unexpected day off matter. And so you defer the e-learning day to a hold a place marker in the spring.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And doing the research, there's actually two approaches that you can take to e-learning days. One would be the one that we're talking about here, where you conduct learning on that day, and you build in the days into the spring, but they're not weather makeup days. They're built in as school holidays. And so you can build in the 3 that you have there and take up to 5 in the fall. The other way that a school district could approach it would be to say, we're going to have school canceled for a hurricane or whatever in October, and then we're going to designate that day in the spring to make that day up. The problem there is one, you lose the opportunity to build in more frequent breaks for students, as we talked about earlier, which is significant. It makes a significant difference. And the other piece of it is that you, particularly on a high school schedule, if I'm losing a day in a semester course in October, when I'm making that day up in April, it's not doing me any good. I'm basically just getting the extra day. So when you think about how that actually plays out, you really get twice of a bonus, I guess, if you take the first model, because you're able to maintain the continuity up front. Okay, and then you're also able to be very purposeful about building in the extra time in the spring when you know that there are going to be a significant number of absences due to illnesses.
Okay, because I'm just thinking, like, if for the younger students, like you're talking about, if you don't know the day before that there's going to be no school tomorrow, then there's no way to provide them school to do. And so I'm wondering if there needs to be like a worst case scenario day in each semester, just for those, probably unlikely, but just in the event that the e-learning day doesn't happen as planned.
I do think at the elementary level, the teachers could still email like a PDF. Again, they have email addresses for the parents.
But I think that goes back to, we have students that don't have Wi-Fi at home. And that's just part of a bigger picture with accessibility in some of our more rural areas.
So I will say our core content coordinators are working very hard now on putting together materials and resources for students that will be relevant at any point during the fall if we were to have a cancellation. So the curriculum there is less specified than, say, if I were moving through a U.S. history curriculum. If you look at what the ELA math, science, social studies standards are in elementary, the work that a student can do there is really based on reading comprehension and numerical fluency, and those types of things can be extended at any point without having to necessarily be the next thing they were doing in class that day. Particularly in elementary, the instructional models there would be very difficult to replicate outside of school anyway. So a lot of that curriculum and content would be extensions of the skills that we know we're working on in those particular grade levels. And they would have access to that before, or they could access it online. But those would be paper copies that would go home earlier in the year, knowing that they would still be relevant at any point during the semester with a cancellation.
With the best practices that you have seen with other districts, financial impact, did they talk about net neutral, positive, negative, one way or the other?
From an operational standpoint, I have not gotten into any of that data. There has been some investment in professional learning and just capacity building for the practice, establishing some leads at grade levels in different schools, and those are basically just annual stipends. But we could look into see if there was any type of a net gain or neutral from an operations standpoint.
Okay. And then second question, specific to the 5-day grace period, how does that modify upcoming school days? So, and I assume if it's a stretch of 3 days that you're out, for example, with the hurricane, the 5-day grace period is not at the end of the last day, it's specific to each day. Is that correct? So it's basically a rolling 5 days if they're continual days.
Essentially, the model that we're proposing for our initial pilot application would be 5 days for the first day to begin upon return, and then subsequent days would add a subsequent date of the grace period.
Gotcha. And then, so what does that look like for the student on kind of the granular level? Are there certain programs throughout the day that are maybe cut during that time to fill in with the learning that should have occurred on the day that they were out? Is that what that looks like? Or
In the event that a student would not essentially keep up on those days when they're out, there is flexibility built in different ways and in our different grade bands. In all of our high schools, there's time built in through the day where students work through some independent learning time. And most of our middle schools, they're called different things, but there are structures built in there as well. And in our elementary schools, again, that's the challenge that just doesn't align up with the way we do business in 6 through 12. So that would be where we take a look at how we can provide some added time to help give the kids the individual support that they need based on where they are when they come back in with those expectations.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Ms. Gilman, this is for the board. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. You're not allowed to ask questions. I'm really sorry. Mr. Bissell will be available at the end, and you're more than welcome to talk, or
Absolutely.
one of us. So. Okay, you can ask him after the meeting. Yeah, it's a good question.
So
Any other questions, board?
I think
Dr.
you said
Powers?
this, but there's no additional hardware costs, and then the software platform to support this is in play now, right? So there's no additional, okay.
That's correct.
So it's just further faculty development for our teachers and how to leverage that online platform. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions, board? Ms. Garris?
Yeah, along the lines Ms. Gilman was talking about, what are the plans for special education?
Yeah, so there are very specific accommodations that go into place in individual education plans and 504s. Our special education department is putting together a plan for students that are enrolled in those specific programs. Specific service hours, they are telling me that those are weekly requirements, and so they can work within the schedule when we come back to provide some of those things. But they feel confident that the majority of the services that are provided can still be provided under this plan. There will be some where there will have to be different accommodations provided. The specifics of that we can make available. We've been having those conversations for about 2.5 months now to make sure that we have all of those bases covered as well. And again, really exemplars from other districts to see what they've done as well. Again, it's a great position to be in the third year of a pilot to learn from some of the work that other folks have had to go through in other districts.
Do our special ed students have one-to-one technology in the older grades?
So special ed's a pretty broad category. There are students that fall under the category of having an IEP, and yes, they absolutely do. There are some other students with other designations within the program that I believe they may not take those devices home, and so there are some of the accommodations that our special education department is working on for an event like this, or an implementation like this.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Mr. Bissell. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
And we'll definitely be in touch.
So our plan moving forward is we're going to come back, some of your questions, I believe we have those recorded. And so Mr. Bissell will come back to us on March 17th to fill out any other questions that you might have. And then part of the rubric is actually if the superintendent supports it, there's so many points. If the superintendent and board chair sign it, there's so many points. But then if the board votes on it, you get maximum number of points. And so we'd like to bring that back to you on March 17th for a vote. And so Mr. Bissell will give us a little more information about specifically, I think, Dr. Guyton, your question about the budget, what that might look like, if there was any other question that we have. So if you have some questions over the next couple weeks, if you would please email me them, and I'll make sure that they are answered in full on the 17th as well.